Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, the life and works of Dutch master Jan Vermeer. If you enjoy this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People. Follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-sized biographies are now available on YouTube and YouTube Music. And please tell a friend about Bite-sized biographies. Now let's get started with our story about Jan Vermeer. Please note that all of the paintings mentioned in this podcast are available to view at someveryfamouspeople.com, and I strongly urge you take a look or try to follow along, as that will greatly enhance your experience as we discuss the remarkable life and works of Jan Vermeer. The life of Johannes Jan Vermeer is as enigmatic as the artistic legacy he left behind. In his lifetime, a regionally respected Dutch artist and art dealer, he quickly faded into obscurity after his untimely death at an early age. It was not until the 19th century that a handful of art scholars resuscitated his reputation, although even these experts misidentified many of his attributed works. Today, his creations have transcended his contemporaries of the Dutch Golden Age of artists, his paintings among the most celebrated and valuable in the art world. Even more impressive, this reputation is the result of no more than 37 artworks, and even this number remains in dispute, underlining the perplexing mystique surrounding Vermeer's life and career. Jan Vermeer was born in Delft, Holland, sometime during the month of October 1632. As a result of Dutch church records, which were more carefully maintained in the 17th century, his baptism was recorded on October 31st of that year. Typical of the lack of information concerning Vermeer's early life, his exact birth date remains unknown. Vermeer was the second child of Reinier Jans and Jan's wife, Digna Baltens. Renier's father, Jan Rierts, was a tailor. His mother, Cornelia, was a dealer in second-hand goods, frequently involved in the disposal of estates, which routinely included artworks of various types, including paintings. This may have been the source of Vermeer's father's interest in artwork, although he was trained as a weaver of silk and wool. He eventually leased an inn on Delft's main market square, supplementing his income with the sale of paintings displayed within this business. Delft in the 17th century was a prosperous city and Dutch commercial center, involved in international trade and the manufacture of fine tapestries, ceramics, and silver jewelry. Even among the lower middle class, paintings were much sought after, and Vermeer's father owned a modest collection of original paintings. By 1625, Reinier and other members of his extended family had adopted the surname Vermeer from the phrase Vandermeer, or by the sea. In 1631, he formally joined the Professional Artisans Guild of St. Luc, registering as an art dealer. His commercial efforts were sufficient enough to, in 1641, allow the leasing of an upgraded and much larger inn, known as the Mechelen, translated literally as large place. This structure was spacious enough to accommodate a first-floor inn, Rainier's textile manufacturing business, and the living quarters of Rainier Jans Vermeer, his wife Digna, their daughter Gertrude, and their son Jan. And, although a step up, this building was purchased via 2 mortgages, which Rainier would not pay off in his lifetime. Although his father's interaction with many of the artists keen on displaying their works at the inn might have been an influence on the boy, nothing is known as to how or why Vermeer became interested in pursuing painting as a profession. However, his training would have been typical of other aspiring artists of the time period, receiving a formal education and also instruction with a guild member qualified to teach the basics of both art and academic subjects like mathematics. Although there are no records of who Vermeer studied with, academics theorize that it is likely that he studied under a neighbor, an artist named Cornelius Reitwick, some of Vermeer's early works adopting the same format of painting, merely the head and facial features of a subject, Reitwick's specialty. But, as in most matters concerning Vermeer's early years, this is merely conjecture. Most likely, he spent a great deal of his adolescence in the inn, run by his parents, circulating among a mixed clientele of artists, art dealers, and the well-to-do, interested in the purchase of paintings. At some point in the late 1640s, Vermeer left Delft to pursue his apprenticeship in another Dutch city, most likely Amsterdam. Upon his father's death in October of 1652, Vermeer returned to Delft to help his mother run the inn. Although only 20, he would also take over the family art dealing business, having finished his apprenticeship and become a member of the Guild of St. Luke. Most likely confident in his professional prospects, in April of 1653, Vermeer, as was the custom of the time, went to the home of Maria Thins to ask for the hand in marriage of her daughter, Katerina. As of 1641, Maria was divorced from her abusive, unproductive husband and had custody of her 2 daughters. This potential union was problematic for 2 reasons. First, Maria Thins' father was the proprietor of a brick manufacturing concern in the Dutch city of Gouda, making her family much more affluent and socially formidable than the innkeeping Vermeers. Secondly, Vermeer was from a Protestant background, and his potential bride was staunchly Catholic in a region that was deeply anti-Catholic, with discrimination against Catholics including disqualification from public office and open hostility. Although Maria refused to sign the official matrimonial deed notarizing the marriage, it occurred anyway on April 20th, 1653. It is believed that subsequently Vermeer probably converted to Catholicism, further consigning him to Delft's social perimeter. Katerina's mother also took the legal step of insulating her daughter's inheritance in the event of Vermeer's bankruptcy. Such a precaution seems wise, as money would always be scarce during the Vermeer marriage. Initially, the couple most likely lived at the Mechelen, but the artist and his wife would produce an abnormally large number of children, 15, with 11 actually reaching some degree of viability. Based on the advancing age of his mother-in-law, the degree of relative luxury compared to the Vermeer family inn, and the necessity for a more appropriate house for his ever-increasing family, Vermeer and his wife eventually moved to the house of Maria Thins. In addition to working as an art dealer, it was also during this time that Vermeer began the process of becoming a serious artist in his own right. He would not be without influences. Delft, then a prominent Dutch center of artistic brilliance and the residence of such master painters as Carl Fabricius and Peter de Hoek. Unlike some of his Dutch contemporaries, his process was meticulous, turning out about 2 paintings annually. Although there is some information about the modest amounts of income generated by Vermeer's gallery sales, and some evidence of interest in the direct purchase of these paintings, as well as a dedicated patron named Ruthven, who routinely purchased Vermeer's original works, it is clear that in his lifetime, Vermeer was unable to support himself on these earnings alone. Additional funding came from both his wife and especially his mother-in-law, who focused on providing for Vermeer's immense family. However, Vermeer's lack of substantial financial success should not indicate that he was obscure in Dutch artistic circles. Twice, in 1662 and 1670, he was appointed as one of two heads of the Guild of St. Luke. He is also mentioned in a 1667 travelogue describing the city of Delft as the artistic successor to the better-known painter at the time, Carl Fabricius. He was also asked to journey to The Hague in 1672 to give his opinion on the quality and authenticity of certain paintings alleged to be by prominent Italian painters. But who specifically bought his paintings, when and where they were created, and even the number of authentic Vermeers that exist today is still a matter of dispute. Most likely Vermeer's first studio was in an upper floor of the family inn, the Mechelen. As previously mentioned, at some point Vermeer and his family relocated to his mother-in-law's house. He also had a studio there on the second floor, and it was here that he created some of his most famous works, his studio frequently assuming the fundamental setting of whatever individuals and objects he depicted. Although little is known about Vermeer's day-to-day existence, two external incidents would have a great impact on his life. The first was a massive explosion of the Delft gunpowder magazine, which occurred on October 12, 1654. Over 30 tons of powder was accidentally ignited, instigating what became known as the Delft thunderclap. This blast killed over 100 people, injured thousands more, and also caused massive structural damage. Vermeer's mother received a small amount of compensation for damage caused to her inn. And among the dead was Carl Fabricius, a protege of Rembrandt. Many of Fabricius's paintings also destroyed in the catastrophe. Although sobering, Vermeer escaped unscathed. The same could not be said of another calamity that befell both Vermeer and the entire country of Holland in 1672. King Louis XIV of France, believing that he had a right to Dutch territory historically ruled by Spain and the Habsburg Holy Roman Empire, invaded Holland with a massive and well-trained army. This invasion almost succeeded in a matter of months. Eventually, Dutch defenses stabilized, but not before a popular panic caused the collapse of the Dutch financial system and Amsterdam's stock market. The situation was so bad that the Dutch people gave a name to this time period, the year 1672, known subsequently as the Rampjaar. To thwart the French invasion, the Dutch defenders deliberately opened the dikes that surrounded the country, a successful short-term tactic that had a long-term destructive impact. Although Holland, after a lengthy 6-year conflict, emerged geographically intact from the war, the Dutch golden age of prosperity, international trade, and colonization came to an end. Economic hard times and concern ending any appetite for art and paintings. Within months, individuals like Vermeer had no market for either their art gallery contents or their own works, as disposable income disappeared. Vermeer spent 2 years following the outbreak of the war attempting to exploit any assets from his in-laws, as well as a modest inheritance from his own mother, who passed away in 1670. This family bequest included the Mechelen that did generate a modest amount of rent. However, the structure was still heavily mortgaged. His economic straits forced Vermeer to borrow 1,000 guilders in 1675, his mother-in-law's assets providing his collateral. The next item in Vermeer's minimal paper trail appears in the burial register of Delft's main church, the Oude Kerk, or Old Church, stating that Jan Vermeer's burial occurred there on December 16, 1675, in a grave owned by his mother-in-law, some of his younger children already previously buried there. The only brief description of what was the cause of Vermeer's death was an account from his wife of Vermeer's last days, apparently so overcome by his financial burdens that he lapsed into a deep depression, and in his last 36 hours something she described as a worsening delirium, which finally resulted in death. Although it is medical hindsight, these general symptoms indicate that Vermeer was most likely the victim of a stroke or cerebral hemorrhage. The register also noted that his casket was conveyed into the church by 14 pallbearers, and the church bell was rung, a ceremony that required considerable expense, most likely again paid for by Vermeer's mother-in-law. Vermeer's wife was left with 10 children and virtually no cash liquidity. Whatever family money of hers or her mother's was tied up in either real estate, future inheritances, or paintings. It was this latter asset that eventually was used to pay off some of Jan Vermeer's debts. However, Katerina first felt it necessary to formally file for bankruptcy, which would allow for a delay in payments to creditors. The appropriate court agreed to this request, and as a result appointed a trustee who was also a prominent citizen of Delft, as well as historically significant, Antony van Leeuwenhoek. Although archaic accounts of this episode implied that the scientist and Vermeer were friends, familiar with each other's work, most likely this appointment was an historical coincidence. He eventually claimed that mother and daughter had shielded certain valuable items in Vermeer's estate as property of his mother-in-law to avoid seizure to pay off debts. Maria Tins then rewrote her will several times to bypass her daughter and bequeath her assets directly to her grandchildren. Katerina was already negotiating with creditors, using some of Vermeer's paintings as bargaining chips. She paid back up to 3 years' worth of debt to the local baker who supplied bread for the extended Vermeer household, with 2 of Vermeer's final paintings, believed to be the guitar player today in the Kenwood House in London, and Lady writing a letter with her maid, presently in Ireland's National Gallery in Dublin. This baker was quite wealthy and had an extensive art collection, which included these paintings, and a third unknown Vermeer that he later sold. However, it is interesting to note that Katerina was not so mercenary about at least one of the paintings that Vermeer himself seemed to hold in special esteem. Today, this painting, perhaps one of Vermeer's most famous, is known as the Art of Painting. Despite his ongoing economic challenges and his completion of the painting sometime between 1665 to 1668, he never sold it. Upon his death, his wife swore out a document in February of 1676 about the time that Vermeer's property was inventoried to determine what could be sold to his creditors that formally willed the painting to her mother. This transfer hopefully recognized by Leeuwenhoek, the estate trustee. Although the trustee was officially skeptical, whether he seized the painting is unknown, but it did make its way onto a list of Vermeers that were auctioned off in 1676, 26 in all, to satisfy the debts of another creditor, a merchant who dealt in wool and cloth. Whether Vermeer's widow or family kept any of his paintings after this time period is unknown, but it is most likely that none were retained. Maria Tins died in 1680, leaving most of her assets to her grandchildren, and naming her daughter and Vermeer's wife as the administrator of these funds. Katerina lived until 1687, passing away at the Delft home of one of her daughters and son-in-law. Whatever assets she had at that time were most likely depleted, her burial expenses paid for by her child. By then her deceased husband and his artistic reputation were already beginning to fade. One further development a decade later accelerated this march to obscurity. As previously mentioned, there is evidence that a wealthy Delft resident named Peter van Ruffen, a prominent art collector, and his wife Maria de Noot were both enthusiastic collectors and patrons of Vermeer. This evidence includes information that upon Peter's death in 1674 and Maria's death in 1681, their daughter Magdalena inherited 20 paintings by Vermeer. This is known because Magdalena married an individual named Jacob Decius in April of 1680 and died shortly thereafter, aged 27, probably in childbirth. Upon her death, an official inventory of the couple's household property was recorded and officially notarized. This inventory not only included the mention of the 20 paintings, it also noted where in the modest residence of the Deciuses that these paintings hung, with 8 alone in the front room, but 20 distributed throughout the home. Today, with most of Vermeer's paintings scattered in small numbers throughout the world, the concept of 20 Vermeer paintings exhibited in a modest private residence is nothing short of mind-boggling. Jacob Decius also died at a relatively young age, 41, in October of 1695. Shortly thereafter, on May 11, 1696, an auction took place in Amsterdam of 134 paintings from various different sources. Included in this auction were 21 Vermeers that came from the deceased Decius's estate. It is believed that at some point a painting believed to be by some other artist was subsequently attributed to Vermeer. Hence, the auction catalog mentioned 21 total paintings. All of these paintings were successfully auctioned for an amount in excess of 1,500 guilders, enough money to buy a reasonably comfortable home. From this point, with this sizable collection dispersing into the hands of numerous other people, and other Vermeers already having disappeared into private unknown hands, the artist's profile and reputation receded entirely. This process was enabled by the practice of some Vermeers being tampered with to imply that they were by a more respected Dutch painter like Rembrandt, De Hoek, or Fabricius, such a designation adding value to a painting that as a Vermeer would not have been as valuable. This only added to the process of diminishing Jan Vermeer's legacy. Dealers and collectors intent on minimizing his work and, whenever possible, attributing it to another more high-profile artist. This diminished reputation continued throughout the 18th century until 1792, when a French art connoisseur and scholar named Jean-Baptiste Pierre Lebrun published an extensive listing and analysis of what he referred to as the Northern School painters from the Low Countries and Germany, organizing approximately 1,350 artists that he was familiar with. Lebrun traveled to the region on numerous occasions, purchasing art and interacting with the area's prominent dealers and collectors, and was considered an expert on the topic. While his directory did not discuss most of the artists he listed in great detail, he did designate what he considered to be the 157 best and most collectible painters, and included engravings of 201 paintings by this core group. In an art journal in 1784, Lebrun had already published an engraving of Vermeer's painting, The Astronomer, and in his travels through Holland was aware of the growing rediscovery and appreciation of Vermeer. In various articles and publications, he continued to refer to Vermeer as one of the most underappreciated of the Dutch Golden Age painters, and put him into the same category as some of the most respected Dutch artists of the era. Catalogs discussing auctions involving works by Vermeer frequently quoted Lebrun's enthusiastic analysis, and suddenly a painting designated as a Vermeer was deemed valuable. However, the artist would still remain an acquired taste of a close-knit circle of art experts and collectors, with many of his paintings not exhibited publicly or even having disappeared. This changed in 1822, when the King of the Netherlands, a newly created domain fashioned by the great powers resulting at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, William I purchased a Vermeer and placed it in the Mauritshuis, a public museum housing what was then the royal collection of approximately 200 paintings. The particular Vermeer in question was known as View of Delft, a depiction of the skyline of the town highlighting its churches. It is believed that the king was interested in this work, as Delft had always been a loyal supporter of his ancestors, comprising the royal dynasty known as the House of Orange. The The public exhibit of a Vermeer, recognized by such a prominent public figure, only increased interest in the artist in the European art world, because the 19th century publication of journals, magazines, and periodicals concerning art was so widespread. Such a medium could greatly increase the stature of a particular artist. In the case of Vermeer, this influence played out as a result of the efforts of another French art critic, promoter, and dealer named Théophile Torre Berger. Torre Berger was critical of French paintings of the time period, asserting that it was too Italian-influenced and was much more positive about Dutch Golden Age painters and what he considered to be their populist realism. Such art criticism of his generation almost always including a political slant. An extensive collector himself, he also purchased several Vermeers, nicknaming the artist the Sphinx of Delft. In 1866, he published 3 articles in the prestigious Gazette des Beaux-Arts, analyzing the artist's style and attributing over 70 paintings as the work of Vermeer, these journal articles eventually comprising an influential book. This inflated number of attributions would prove to be overly generous, but suddenly Vermeer became the rage of the collecting world, a clique of individuals now dominated by the nouveau riche American wealth of the Gilded Age. By the beginning of the 20th century, the artist's work became a rare, high-prestige item, sought after by the likes of U.S. steel magnate Henry Frick, heiress Isabella Stewart Gardner, and railroad magnate Collis P. Huntington, and the prices paid for his works skyrocketed accordingly. Americans aggressively outbidding their more economically staid or even newly strapped European competition. The hunt for authentic Vermeers was on. Any potential authentication meant an immediate windfall. Even today, the exact number of paintings that are universally accepted as genuine Vermeers is 34, with 3 other paintings considered genuine by a significant number of art experts and curators. Even some of the 34 have recently been subjected to debate over attribution or even authenticity. Each of these 37 paintings have a remarkable origin, provenance, and ownership trail that make them as unique as Vermeer himself. Vermeer's earliest surviving work is ostensibly the 1655 St. Praxedis, a depiction of a Roman Christian martyr that is a copy of a painting composed by the Florentine artist Felice Ficciarelli, also known as Felice Riposo. Please note that all of the paintings discussed here, again, as we mentioned, can be viewed at the website someveryfamouspeople.com, including St. Praxedis. Vermeer's depiction is similar to Riposo's, with the exception that the kneeling martyr squeezing blood into a decorative urn is also holding a crucifix. This is deemed as a significant symbol that Vermeer, recently married into a Catholic family, is indicating his conversion to the Catholic faith. Part of the confusion over the painting's authenticity is its complete lack of any provenance until it was sold to a collector in the middle of the 20th century. Exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1969 as an example of Florentine artistry, the painting generated speculation based on its visible signature, Mir 1655. The painting was sold subsequently after this exhibit, the sale most likely enabled by the newly discussed Vermeer attribution. The buyer officially was the Barbara P. Johnson Collection Foundation, an entity formed by Barbara P. Johnson. As Barbara P. she was employed as a chambermaid at the estate of John Seward Johnson I, heir and son of Robert Wood Johnson I, the co-founder of the pharmaceutical company Johnson & Johnson. P. allegedly first got the attention of her employer by intelligently discussing pieces in his art collection. After a lengthy extramarital affair, Johnson I divorced his second wife and married P. The groom was 76, the bride was 34. When Johnson I died 12 years later, P. inherited his entire fortune worth $400 million. His 6 disinherited children sued, but ultimately settled for a small percentage of the estate. The alleged Vermeer was subsequently displayed with other artwork in a chapel in Monaco, where Pia Secca lived until her death in 2013. Her entire art collection was sold by Christie's in 2014. After her death, St. Praxedis purchased for approximately $7 million, a bit on the lower end of the scale, most likely as a result of its dubious attribution. Purchased by a Japanese corporate entity, today it is on loan to the Museum of Western Art, Tokyo, Japan. Painted at about the same time as St. Praxedis, Christ in the House of Martha and Mary is another early Vermeer work whose attribution is disputed. It is again an atypical Vermeer subject involving a biblical theme and did not appear in the inventory composed after the artist's death. It disappeared for over 250 years until, while in the hands of two British art dealers, a restoration revealed Vermeer's signature. It is also unusual in that its size, 6 by about 5.5 feet, makes it the largest Vermeer in existence, another aspect which is added to the skepticism concerning its attribution. Shortly after this painting was attributed to Vermeer in 1901, it was purchased by a Scottish textile industrialist, William Allen Coates, one of the wealthiest men in Britain, who was in the process of assembling an impressive art collection, focusing mostly on 19th century French Impressionists. When Coates died in 1926, his family donated the painting to the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh, where it resides today. Diana and Her Companions is another early work of Vermeer's and also atypical in that it deals with a mythological figure. Such a subject would have been commonplace, and early in his career, Vermeer would have encountered other representations of Diana and her entourage, even by other Dutch painters of the time period. Purchased at auction by a British native, Neville Goldschmidt, who had business interests in The Hague, the painting was initially attributed to a protege of Rembrandt's, Nicholas Mies. Upon Goldschmidt's death, his widow auctioned off his entire collection, and the painting was purchased for eventual permanent donation to the Maurits House in The Hague. It was not until the early 20th century that Dutch experts theorized that the painting was possibly by Vermeer, based on a faint signature discovered through restoration, and a similarity to Mary and Martha was acknowledged. It is with Vermeer's fourth painting, the 1656 The Procuress, that he makes a dramatic breakaway from both traditional themes and adopts a new and individual style. Instead of a religious or mythological theme, this painting delves into a startling scene from contemporary life, a representation of a transaction in a brothel between a customer and a prostitute. The customer has his hand placed lewdly on the upper torso of the prostitute. Two other spectators look on with leering expressions. Although Vermeer himself was breaking new ground, this painting was not an original concept. In his mother-in-law's will, a painting also known as the Procuress, painted in 1622 by Dirk van Baburen with similar characters, was listed among her property, and certainly would have been displayed in her home and visible to Vermeer. It must have made quite an impression, as Vermeer would also use the painting in some of his very detailed backgrounds in two of his other paintings. In addition to the three subjects that mimicked van Baburen's work, Vermeer added a fourth figure, looking directly at the viewer, with a provocative smile and holding a drinking vessel. Art scholars believe this to be a Vermeer self-portrait, clothed and with longish hair greatly resembling the figure in Vermeer's subsequent The Art of Painting. Unlike many of his other works, the provenance of the Procuress is rather straightforward. It was acquired in 1741 by the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, Friedrich Augustus II, who with his father Augustus II systematically bought up as many valuable and high-profile European paintings as possible, in this case from a noble Bohemian family, the Wallensteins. This Vermeer was placed in one of Europe's most prominent art collections, housed in Dresden's Gemäldegalerie Altemeister, or Old Masters Picture Gallery, in the royal family's Zwinger complex of galleries and gardens. It was in this location that for centuries the nobility of Saxony and eventually the region's public enjoyed this and numerous other classic paintings, including another Vermeer, woman reading a letter by an open window, Raphael's The Sistine Madonna, and other works by Rembrandt, Titian, Albrecht Dürer, and Hans Holbein. However, when war broke out in Europe and on the Eastern Front, all of the great European museum collections faced an unprecedented threat of damage by warfare, vandalism, and even outright theft by invading armies. The impact on the Gemäldegalerie Altemeister collection of Dresden was profound. As the Soviet army eventually repulsed the Nazi invasion, special battalions authorized by Stalin himself were authorized to focus on the capture and repatriation to the Soviet Union of any artistic article of value, especially the most prominent museum paintings. Despite German attempts to first protect and then hide valuable artworks from both Western or Soviet capture, the hidden Dresden art cache was eventually discovered. Much of this looting happened so quickly and secretly that by war's end and the brewing hostility of the Cold War, despite removing thousands of obviously confiscated artworks worth billions of dollars, Stalin's regime would not even acknowledge what, if any, art was in its possession. Initially, any German or Western request to the Soviet government to return or even discuss looted art was rebuffed. And in the case of the Dresden artworks, it was first ordered that the paintings be exhibited with the collection at Moscow's Pushkin Museum. This compilation, as well as other prominent artworks previously on exhibit at Leningrad's Hermitage Palace, were controversial, as most had been expropriated from wealthy private owners after the Russian Revolution. Just as the exhibition of the more prominent Dresden works were about to be opened to the public, Stalin himself decreed that the paintings be segregated into two separate exhibition halls, only accessible by museum staff and prominent members of the government. Eventually, Stalin would order that access to these exhibit halls be completely restricted to only the museum director and a handful of museum staff and curators. Like human beings during the Stalinist era, the paintings were essentially disappeared. But with the death of Stalin and the Soviet perspective that relations with East Germany and its residents needed improving, it was agreed that some, but not all, of the cultural items looted from the country would be returned. This included much of the Dresden Museum collection, but not before the Russian public was able to access a special May 1955 exhibit that was so large it displaced much of the museum's main collection, that was temporarily relocated to storerooms. The museum was kept open for as much as 14 hours a day for 4 months and was visited by 1.2 million people. The exhibit officially closed, and the painstaking process of transferring many of the German paintings began. This process was also complicated by the lack of an appropriate exhibit space, the Zwinger complex having been seriously damaged by the Dresden Allied bombing of February 1945. It would not be until 1960 that the Gemäldegalerie Altemeister would formally reopen. This collection, including Vermeer's The Procuress, sadly, over 450 paintings still remain missing today, either destroyed or retained by the Russian government, who still describe such retention of any German art as just reparations. Vermeer's next work, completed in 1557, is entitled A Girl Asleep. It features a young woman seated at a table, either gazing downward or verging on sleep, the table in front of her occupied by various mundane objects that collectively may have symbolic significance. Known for many years as a maid asleep, art expert analysis indicated that rather than merely an ordinary depiction of a domestic employee dozing off, the tipped-over wine glass, knife, and open jug indicate both a recently failed social interaction between the female and possible suitor. As the subject is wearing jewelry, which was not permitted for domestic workers in 17th century Dutch society, she is clearly not a maid. Part of the Decius auction of 1696, A Girl Asleep's provenance was unusually straightforward. widely acknowledged as a painting by Vermeer as a result of being part of this collection. It passed through the hands of a few Dutch collectors before making its way to France, where it was purchased and resold by several art dealers before it was finally purchased from the estate of Rudolf Kahn, which included Rembrandt's Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer, at one time the most expensive painting ever sold. Kahn's collection included 9 other Rembrandts and paintings by Van Dyck, Hals, and A Girl Asleep. The formidable British-based art dealer Joseph Duveen purchased the entire Kahn collection. Duveen's mission statement summed up with his famous quote, "Europe has a great deal of art, and America has a great deal of money." One American with a great deal of money and the typical passion for art that consumed most nouveau riche Americans was Benjamin Altman, the founder of New York City's B. Altman and Company department store chain. Duveen sold him 4 Rembrandts, some sculpture, and A Girl Asleep for $500,1908, about $17 million today. Upon his death in 1913, Altman's spectacular collection of 60 paintings, including A Girl Asleep, was donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This Vermeer, one of several on exhibit at the museum today. With his next 1657 effort, Woman Reading a Letter by an Open Window, Vermeer concocted a painting that involved a format that was prominent in many of his future efforts. A single individual involved in a private moment in a rectangular representation of a small room in a private home. This room prominently contained a window, which allowed the artist to involve different shades of lighting on the subject, adding a dimensional effect. At least 30% of the painting also incorporates a folded curtain, as well as an intricately colored bedspread or blanket, other items that would reappear in future paintings. It has also been speculated that the model in this work was Vermeer's wife, Katerina, the woman's features appearing to be similar to several other female subjects in Vermeer's paintings. This painting was also purchased in 1742 by the Elector of Saxony and was featured in the Gemäldegalerie Gallery Altemeister in Dresden thereafter. Unlike the Procurus, the other Vermeer in the same gallery, this painting was originally attributed to Rembrandt, possibly to increase its sales value. Eventually re-identified as a work by Peter de Hoek, it was not until the scholarship of Torre Berger in the mid-19th century that the painting was properly identified. Woman Reading a Letter by an Open Window also underwent the same odyssey during World War II of the Dresden paintings looted by the Soviet Union and was also returned in 1955. Like many extremely valuable paintings subjected to historical study and technical examination, the work was X-rayed frequently, and like several Vermeers, changes to the original were detected. In this case, a large painting of Cupid was found to have been painted over, subsequent to Vermeer's own completion. Because it was determined that this change was not part of the original composition, based on chemical differences in the substances applied, the decision was made to return the painting to its previous condition. Because the presence of Cupid adds the symbolism of the letter being a love letter, this restoration was also considered appropriate and was concluded in 2021. You can compare both the original and restored versions at someveryfamouspeople.com. In 1658, with his Officer and Laughing Girl, Vermeer returned to a familiar theme previously explored in A Young Girl Asleep. This newer painting of a young woman conversing with a brightly colored gentleman, wearing a large brimmed hat and a long scarlet coat with white ruffles. The woman, seated at a table, dressed in upper-class finery, holds a glass of wine and an expression of smiling enthusiasm. Although the officer, also seated, is seen in profile, the body language of the two figures indicates a strong interest and connection. Behind the woman, attached to the wall, is a map of Holland. The officer's hat comprised of beaver pelts imported from the Dutch territory in the New World, now the U.S. East Coast. The room where the two figures are situated greatly resembles the previous Woman Reading a Letter by an Open Window. Complete with an open window, something displayed on the background wall and different shades of lighting and dimension. Is this just an innocent scene of two individuals having a conversation? Or is there a deeper connection and the prelude to something more intimate? That is up to the viewer to decide, and speculation over that question has been debated for centuries. Originally, the painting was among the group of works auctioned from the Decius collection in 1696. It made its way through the hands of various private collections until it was auctioned off several times in the 19th century, identified incorrectly as a painting by de Hock. By the time it was acquired by the American art dealer Nedler and Company, it was correctly designated as a Vermeer. American entrepreneur Henry Clay Frick, an extremely wealthy steel and coal magnate, had already purchased a Vermeer in 1901. Girl interrupted at her music, and like most American old master collectors, was eager to buy as many Vermeers as possible. By 1911, Frick had moved to New York from Pittsburgh and built a Fifth Avenue mansion that was both his home and repository for his extensive art collection. He bought Officer and Laughing Girl for approximately $230,000, believed the highest amount paid for any single painting at the time. Although Frick died of a heart attack in 1919, it was not until the death of his wife in 1930 that his New York City mansion was converted to a museum that opened to the public in 1935. All three of the Vermeers that Frick was able to purchase, including Officer and Laughing Girl, have been on display at the Frick Museum ever since. Although today any authenticated Vermeer is considered an art masterpiece, the Milkmaid, completed in 1658, was greatly appreciated even within a few years of its completion. Among Vermeer's most recognizable works, its depiction of a young female servant pouring milk out of a jug with a look of resigned dedication, relegated to a simple, dark kitchen area, has a haunting quality that resonated when the painting was auctioned as part of the Decius collection in 1696. The painting was purchased for 175 guilders, the second highest amount paid for any Vermeer auctioned that day. Only a subsequently painted spectacular landscape of the city of Delft generated a higher price, 200 guilders. The Milkmaid's bleak setting does include the typical window to the left of the canvas, significantly closed, indicating fall or even winter. A box-like object on the floor is a typical foot warmer used during the seasonal chill, also indicative of a cold gray day. To underline the sparse nature of the setting, there is no decorative painting on the bare wall behind the Milkmaid. There is still enough light streaming in to provide a halo-like illumination. Vermeer perhaps intent on depicting such a humble, hard-working, virtuous servant as an example of an everyday Dutch Madonna. The Dutch government also underlined the national appreciation for both this depiction and the artist when, in 1908, it was purchased from the wealthy von Winter family of Dutch art collectors. Despite national debate over the appropriation of a great deal of public money for such a purpose, the Dutch Parliament approved the funding. The Milkmaid was among 39 paintings acquired by the Dutch government and placed in the permanent collection of the Dutch National Art Museum, the Rijksmuseum. Vermeer returned to a familiar theme with his next two works, Gentleman with a Girl Drinking, also known as The Glass of Wine, and The Girl with a Glass of Wine, both painted around 1660. In both paintings, we have the familiar corner of a room, the open window to the left providing light, and the glass of wine, again a well-dressed man is engaging a seated female, but he is standing, having just poured the young woman a glass of wine. In presumably his chair, a stringed musical instrument is visible and songbooks on the table, but he curiously has no wine glass himself and is still gripping the jug of wine, intent on pouring the female another glass as soon as she is finished. Did he first try to interest her in a duet without success? And is wine his next foray into romance? Unlike the previous cavalier and young woman, where the female is clearly smiling and engaged, this individual is looking downward, away from the gentleman, her arms rigid and at her side, disinterested possibly, even apprehensive. The Girl with a Glass of Wine features a first for any Vermeer subject. The general theme is the same, the open window, a single room with table, but in this painting there are 3 individuals and 2 potential male suitors, one in the corner leaning on his elbow, either intoxicated or depressed over the lack of interest from the female. The other, only inches away from the female object of his attention, his hand gently lifting her hand and the wine glass it holds. Instead of looking at him or into the distance, she is looking directly at the viewer of the painting, an inscrutable look on her face, intoxicated, laughingly disdainful of her pushy suitor, politely cheerful. It is impossible to know and open to interpretation. Both of these paintings also depict a setting involving affluence, inlaid harlequin floors, well-dressed subjects, gilt-frame paintings, and even intricately leaded and decorated stained glass windows, a clear contrast from the drab setting of the milkmaid. The glass of wine was purchased in Delft by the von Loon family, noted collectors of Dutch masters' paintings. They fled Holland when the French invaded in 1794 for England, eventually selling the painting into British hands and ultimately to an art dealer in London who sold it to the Berlin National Museum. The Girl with a Glass of Wine was part of the Decius auction and was purchased as early as 1710 by the enlightened Herzog Anton Ulrich of Braunschweig, also known as Anthony Ulrich, the Duke of Brunswick. The Duke's spectacular art collection, including this Vermeer, is housed today in the museum that bears his name in Braunschweig, Lower Saxony, Germany. Perhaps tired of painting interiors in approximately 1660, Vermeer next embarked on the composition of 2 very different kinds of landscapes. One known as the Little Street is more of a slice of life, a part of a large house depicted with intricate recreation of both brickwork and leaded windows, 3 women involved in various domestic chores. Although recent research has attempted to locate the exact location of this painting, whether this was an actual rendition of a real space or Vermeer's invention is still unknown. Part of the von Winter collection, this painting was purchased in April of 1921 by Sir Henry de Turding and gifted to the Rijksmuseum. De Turding was born in Amsterdam and rose through the ranks of Royal Dutch Shell to become its CEO and chairman in 1900. His role in supplying oil to the Allies during World War I earned him a knighthood, and he was one of the most prominent businessmen of the early 20th century, nicknamed the Napoleon of Oil. However, he was also a fervent anti-communist, outraged by the Soviet expropriation of Royal Dutch Shell oil fields in Azerbaijan. He became a supporter of the German Nazi Party, initially funding the Nazi Party in its rise to power, and eventually providing the German government with financial support in the mid-30s. This perspective was controversial. It forced him to resign in 1936. He retired to Germany and died soon afterwards, his 1939 funeral officially honored by the Nazi government. Although today a forgotten disgrace in the Netherlands, the Rijksmuseum certainly kept de Turding's gift, the Little Street. The only other Vermeer landscape is the View of Delft. Also completed around 1660, one of the artist's largest paintings, a very traditional depiction of the Delft skyline while Vermeer was a resident. As already mentioned, the painting's realism impressed William I, King of the Netherlands, who purchased it for permanent placement in the Mauritshuis Museum, The Hague. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about Jan Vermeer. Information for this podcast came from the books Vermeer by Roberta Diatta and Vermeer, The Complete Paintings by Walter Liedtke. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.